Maybe you grew up the same way I did, seeing the book The Late Great Planet Earth on the bookshelves of your parents and other family members. Or maybe you just experienced secondhand the cultural zeitgeist that spawned from its publication and declaration to be the best-selling non-fiction book of the 1970s. It not only influenced a large swath of interdenominational Christians from the 70s on through the 90s, but it also paved the way for the film series A Thief in the Night, which came out throughout the 70s and 80s, as well as the Left Behind phenomenon of the 90s and early 2000s. It has stoked rumors of the rapture and the end times during just about every global conflict and political movement, not to mention the current war and genocide happening in the Middle East. Hi, I'm Andy and my pronouns are they, them. Welcome to Morning Thoughts. This is a podcast where I talk about what's been on my mind over the last week when it comes to topics related to evangelical fundamentalism, and then cover what I've read or learned over the past week about things that I was never taught growing up within that particular sect of Christianity. This episode is the second part of a two-part video covering America's most popular end times theology and the men who invented and perpetuated it. If you haven't seen last week's video or the intro video from the week before that, I encourage you to go check those out first so that you have a foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll put those links in the description for easy access. So who exactly is Hal Lindsey? Let's get into it.
I'm speaking to you today from the last battlefield on planet Earth.
Sure, Jan.
While some have called him the father of modern prophecy, Hal Lindsey is anything but. Throughout his teenage and early adult years, Hal Lindsey tried to become a Christian 3 times, even getting baptized all 3 times that he tried. He was a college dropout who had joined the Coast Guard in order to dodge the Korean War draft and be able to keep partying. Lindsey then became a New Orleans tugboat captain and went through his first marriage. It was after his first wife left him that he really got religion. Lindsey's claim is that after he moved back home with his parents and started reading the Bible on a regular basis, that God spoke directly to him while he was reading Moses' story in the book of Exodus. In Lindsey's claim, he says that God told him, "You're going to be another bush through which I'm going to speak." Yikes. In 1956, a friend invited him to a Bible prophecy lecture. This was during the Suez Canal crisis, an invasion of Egypt and the Gaza Strip by Israel and their Western allies in order to regain control of the canal itself, which had just been nationalized by the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. At the lecture, Lindsey was able to meet the speaker, local pastor Robert Thiem Jr. He immediately began attending Thiem's church. While Lindsey thought he'd found a spiritual father in the man, the reality was that the man was racist and authoritarian, certain that he had all the answers to life. Thanks to his new connections in high places, in 1958, Lindsey made it into Dallas Theological Seminary, despite the fact that he had no undergraduate education. It was during his junior year there that he met his second wife, who was an employee of Campus Crusade for Christ, an organization dedicated to proselytizing the faith and assimilating college students into evangelical fundamentalism all over the country. Once he graduated, the Lindseys left for California to work for Campus Crusade together. So when did he become so interested in making prophecy his brand? In 1974, Lindsey admitted in an interview that he always got the biggest amount of response when he preached about the second coming. It was after that he decided to open his own Christian leadership training school. When The Late Great Planet Earth came out, it was marketed through churches and Christian bookstores, quickly selling enough copies that the publisher Bantam was interested in doing the second printing. What was so compelling about this apocalyptic text? Lindsey's core idea was that following the state of Israel being established in 1948, that he was able to take the end times prophecies of the Bible and match them up to the current state of world affairs in the 1970s. The only problem was that the rapture didn't happen. I guess it wasn't a problem for Lindsey though, because he went on to write more books with updated prophecies and signs of the end times throughout the rest of his career, even through today. The man still has a television show on Christian TV where he talks about the same exact things. While Lindsey never wrote about himself or his personal private life and really dedicated himself to never publicizing anything about his family, it was after 1975 that he met his third wife, a woman who was 25 years younger than him. But if that wasn't enough, his fourth wife was even younger than that. Lindsey's fans predictably never cared about the state of his marital affairs as long as he kept publishing and republishing that end times good that they were so desperate for throughout the 80s and the 90s. Following Lindsey's call for evangelicals to pay attention to politics, the religious right was born via the creation of the Moral Majority shortly thereafter, thanks to the scheming duo of Paul Weyrich, founder of the powerful conservative Christian think tank the Heritage Foundation, and Jerry effing Falwell Sr., who needs no introduction. Roll the clip!
The killer typhoon, 60 feet high, pumping 750 gallons of water per minute over the top. And this man, the Right Reverend Jerry Falwell, will today attempt the challenge of the typhoon. He'll be suspended in midair, free-falling for 15 feet.
Look at that crowd out there. People will go anywhere to see somebody be executed. Oh, my God. Oh, it's so cold. Oh. Lie back. Get his back there. Oh, 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 I'm ready. Go for it.
Before we continue, please take a second to smash that like button for me to help make sure that other people get the chance to see this really important information. In a 2018 article for Only Sky Media, Captain Cassidy writes that Hal Lindsey thrives in an excessively permissive, overly forgiving atmosphere. He's made a solid living for decades offering up false prophecy after false prophecy. He lives in the serene knowledge that nobody will ever hold his feet to the fire over anything he gets wrong. Really, the mere fact that he can still be out there slinging the same old tired lines and have a market and an audience for this tribe speaks to certain Christians' lack of discernment and their love for anyone willing to pander to their grotesque fantasies. Lindsey has failed so many times as a prophet, yet certain factions of evangelicals just keep coming back to him for more. The fact that he's made an enormous amount of money off these books is disgusting, and so is the secret that he was keeping for the first 20 years of his writing career. Lindsey was 40 years old when he published his first book. Before that, he hadn't written anything but term papers in seminary, but that didn't matter. It has long been common for evangelicals to have ghostwriters for their books. Even Billy Graham did it. However, Lindsey kept the name of his ghostwriter's secret for 2 decades because Lindsey's ghostwriter, C.C. Carlson, was actually named Carol C. Carlson, a woman. The horror! The very gender prohibited from preaching and teaching the evangelical faith. Of course, Lindsey had to keep that suppressed. It wasn't until the 90s that Carlson's name began appearing aside Lindsey's name on the books. While I don't agree with their system of belief, I'm glad Carlson finally got the credit for her sensational writing style that was a catalyst for so many people reading it and the book doing so well. I mean, obviously, I wish it was never written in the first place because it's just a bunch of junk, but if it had to be written, the woman who wrote it should get the credit. So what do you need to know about the late great planet Earth and why it's still so important today, even though it's full of faulty theology and failed prophecies? Although it was published over 50 years ago, its influence continues to be felt in many segments of American Christianity. It was instrumental in popularizing dispensationalism. We talked about that theological framework last week, especially the book of Revelation. Along with the Scofield Reference Bible and the Left Behind series, all of these things helped to spread this theological perspective among American Christians. And this book created a renewed interest in end times prophecy across denominations. The book's popularity led to the creation of numerous Bible prophecy ministries and organizations focused on interpreting current events in light of biblical prophecy. These ministries often produced books, documentaries, conferences, anything that could make money to promote their views. Sounds like some people saw what an easy cash grab it was for Lindsey and wanted to get in on the scam. While the book had many supporters, it did face criticism from certain theologians, scholars, and liberal Christians who questioned its theological and interpretive approach. Some critics argued that the book oversimplified complex biblical texts and that its predictions did not align with traditional Christian doctrine. The beginning of the book starts with a discussion about how Moses set the standard for what a true prophet was, before painting the picture of how Daniel meets all of those qualifications. Then, by Lindsey's logic, This is why Daniel and other prophets must be believed. After that, Lindsey takes us on a wild journey through inerrantist interpretations of ancient texts that were actually recorded as commentary on events during the times in which they were written. Let's talk about the late great claims that whipped our parents and grandparents into a wild frenzy of eschatological speculation. Throughout the book, Lindsey introduces Darby's modern concept of the rapture, in which true believers in Christ will be taken up to heaven before a period of tribulation happens on earth to those who were left behind. Don't forget that we learned last week that dispensationalism developed from the theology of John Nelson Darby, who lived and proselytized during the 1800s. In the book, Lindsey argues that the world is moving toward a cataclysmic conclusion as predicted in the Bible. He believes that current events and global trends align with biblical prophecies regarding the end of the world. He uses Daniel, Ezekiel, and other prophets of the Hebrew Bible, even though biblical scholars have clearly established that those prophets were prophesying for those in their own day, not Jesus' day and not our day. Lindsey also emphasizes the significance of Israel in end times events. He was famous for suggesting that the reestablishment of the state of Israel in 1948 was a crucial fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That's why he predicted the rapture for 1988, because the generation who was there for the reestablishment would still be alive. Another huge focal point of Lindsey's is the emergence of the Antichrist, who he and many other evangelicals believe will deceive many and play a central role in the end times scenario, such as bringing enough peace to Israel and Palestine that Israel would be able to build their third temple. What's really interesting is that the word Antichrist never appears in the book of Revelation. In fact, in the New Testament, it only appears in 1st and 2nd John, where the definition of the word Antichrist is described as anyone who denies the Father and the Son. Many fundamentalists claim that Daniel 11 talks about the Antichrist, but the word is never used there either. The late great planet Earth also describes a period of tribulation and chaos on Earth here after the rapture, which is a foundational point in this dispensational premillennialism that we've been talking about so much over the past few weeks. Various calamities and judgments are supposed to befall humanity, and the second Left Behind book, Tribulation Force, is a fictionalized narrative of this supposed time to come. So you can kind of see how these books were made to lead us to believe that they were, fictionalized narratives of the things that were actually going to happen. Like, sure, maybe the people in the books were fake, but what was happening to them was actually going to happen in the future. Lindsey holds the now common fundamentalist belief that Jesus Christ will return to earth after the tribulation to defeat the forces of evil and establish his new kingdom. Throughout the book, Lindsey points to various contemporary events and trends, such as wars, natural disasters, and societal changes. He says that these signs mean that the end times are approaching. Of course, we know that every generation over the last 150 years has done this, and nothing has come to pass. One of the reasons that evangelical fundamentalists and even other denominations of Christianity seem to be so concerned about biblical prophecy and rapture right now has to do with the conflict in the Middle East and the genocide that is occurring. Because in their minds, if Israel is able to take over completely and get rid of the Palestinians, then they will have the ability to build their third temple, and that will usher about the return of Jesus. I know I talked about this in another episode recently, but I just cannot imagine dealing with real people's lives based on these prophecies that have been interpreted by men as young as our great grandfathers. The late great planet Earth uses vivid and dramatic imagery from the Bible to describe apocalyptic events that Lindsey insists will occur. He pairs the events from the book of Revelation with upcoming global events that he says will happen. He also matches up mentions from Revelation, certain countries such as Magog and others that he claims corresponds with other European countries that would be at war during the end times. It's funny how fundamentalists only want a literal reading of the Bible until it comes down to prophecy, and then they're willing to twist and interpret the words to mean whatever it is they want them to. There's no reference to Europe in the Bible, aside from Greece and Rome, obviously, and there's definitely zero mention of China. Lindsey goes in hard on China in this book. A lot of what he writes is pretty disgusting and racist, probably no surprise there. He claimed that their massive army could be one of the armies mentioned in Revelation.
When the book of Revelation warned that 200 million men would decide the fate of our planet, is it only coincidence that Red China today has an army exactly that size?
It's also funny that he couldn't manage to admit there was no account of the United States found within Revelation. Instead, he speculates in a way that is meant to sensationalize and cause panic and cause people to take what he's saying seriously as a real possibility. On page 150 of my copy of the book, he writes, "It is quite possible that Ezekiel was referring to the United States in part when he said, 'I will send fire upon those who dwell securely in the coastlands.' As if there aren't coastlands all over the globe, first of all. How's he gonna say it's quite possible? It's the freaking biggest stretch ever. But this is the kind of sensationalist writing that gets his readers to listen to him, get all whipped up into a frenzy, and start believing what he's saying. Since the first publishing of this book over 50 years ago at this point, there has been no fulfillment of any of these events. Despite this, the effects of Lindsey's book being published were felt throughout the world and throughout several generations. Thank you for being here with me today during this episode of Morning Thoughts. I hope that you learned something you didn't know before. If you did, please hit that follow button and the notification bell to be alerted when I have new content come out. If you'd like to support me further, I have a Buy Me a Coffee. You can find that at buymeacoffee.com/assignedXTIAN. Before we close out this episode of the pod, I'd like to leave you with some of the most awkward, racist, sexist, ignorant comments found within the text of the late great Planet Earth, and proof of Billy Graham's anti-Semitism that was caught on tape in the 1970s. If you're still here, you're in for an interesting time. On page 71 of my copy of the late great Planet Earth, he says, "For centuries, Asia has had a tradition of backwardness." Yikes. There's even a chapter in this book entitled The Yellow Peril. I am not making this up. There's another quote on page 79 that says, "The 7th chapter of Daniel, written before the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, was known by the scribes as the greatest chapter in the Old Testament." The scribes that were writing Daniel not only had no concept of the Christian Old Testament, the Tanakh hadn't even been collected together in a series of documents that were put together, as one text. Saying that the scribes knew the 7th chapter of Daniel was the greatest chapter in the Old Testament, if you wanted to make that claim, you'd still be wrong, but at least don't do it with lazy writing. Oh boy, this is a good one. On page 130, "Our eternal bodies will not be subject to aging, pain, or decay. Just think how excited women can get about a new wardrobe. How much more excited should we be about acquiring a new body?" Sexist, but go off, I guess. Okay, this one. Now we're getting into the anti-Semitism of Lindsey, and not only Lindsey, the anti-Semitism inherent in evangelicalism, honestly. Page 131. "In the Old Testament, evangelizing was the task of the Jew. Of course, he seldom fulfilled that obligation, which is one of his great failures." This is what happens when you try to say that the Old Testament and the New Testament are the same thing, and that they're talking about even the same God and the same, obviously not the same religion, but saying that Jewish people should have been evangelizing about Christian God, that's just a whole bunch of BS made up on faulty theology. Here's the last quote that I want to talk about, and then we'll be diving a little more deeply into it. On page 99, "After the Christians are gone, God is going to reveal himself in a special way to 144,000 Jews. 144,000 physical, literal Jews who are going to believe with a vengeance that Jesus is the Messiah. They are going to be 144,000 Billy Grahams turned loose on the earth. The earth will never know a period of evangelism like this period." Okay, this is awkward and awful. It's really gross to talk about Jewish people being converted, forcibly converted, it sounds like, to evangelicalism and comparing them to Billy Graham, especially after his anti-Semitic conversation with Richard Nixon that was leaked in 1972. Do you know about this? You're going to want to. The following is an excerpt from James Warren's 2018 article, Billy Graham's Troubling, Nasty Nixon Moment. The Vietnam War was raging, and Nixon was often very focused on his re-election campaign. I listened as he made a string of bigoted remarks about Jews and what he deemed their undue influence. Graham responded, "This stranglehold has got to be broken or the country is going down the drain." That line was picked up by the media at the time and included in some remembrances following his demise, but most of the conversation was not. "You believe that?" Nixon said, seeming to be pleasantly surprised with affirmation of an anti-Semitic streak that courses through many of the Nixon Oval Office conversations. Yes, sir, Graham said to Nixon and H.R. Haldeman, the top Nixon aide later imprisoned for his role in Watergate, who was apparently in the room for most, even all of the conversation. Oh boy, replied Nixon, so do I. I can't ever say that, but I believe it. No, but if you get elected a second time, then we might be able to do something, Graham replied. Graham referenced friends of his own in the press who were Jewish and how they swarm around me and are friendly to me. But, he added, they don't know how I really feel about what they're doing to this country. It got worse. Nixon brought up a topic of which he said we can't talk about it publicly, the alleged influence of Jews in Hollywood and the press. Nixon, being Nixon, qualified this broadside by declaring that this didn't mean that all the Jews were bad, but nevertheless, most were of leftist persuasion and desired peace at any price except where support for Israel is concerned. The best Jews are actually the Israeli Jews. That's right, agreed Graham, who would further aid and abet his host's declaration that a powerful bloc of media Jews confronted Nixon. And they're the ones putting out the pornographic stuff, Graham said, though it's a bit unclear to what he was alluding to. When I broke the story in 2002, Graham said through a spokesman that he could not respond regarding the transcript because he didn't remember it. He would later issue a written apology and meet with Jewish leaders, but he forever maintained that he could not recall the conversation. Anyway, just doing my part to remind everyone that America's pastor was a raging anti-Semite. Okay, have a great week. Bye!
After 8 years with Campus Crusade for Christ, traveling all over the country and many parts of the world, speaking on this subject, that's how I got interested in writing.
How many copies has Late Great Planet Earth sold?
It's over 18 million now, and it's in 31 languages. By the way, that is something that is a sign of the times. Only God could do something like that. It's not that it's such a great book or so well written, but it's that the information in it, I believe, is so important and God has blessed it. The New York Times designated that the bestseller of the decade, which, when you take a book on Bible prophecy and God does something like that, that's a sign of the times.